part of the important distinction here between discovery and implementation is that once you've discovered something and you've done it really well and you've published it and it's in a journal and it's out there in the world, that's great. But if you don't, if it just sits on the shelf behind me or behind you, Kevin, and we basically have it there and it's collecting dust, that knowledge doesn't actually make its way into improving practice and actually changing the way we do things, then we haven't completed that cycle, that virtuous learning cycle.
Oh, hello. Welcome to Informatics in the Round, the podcast that's designed so that everyone can become a part of the dialogue surrounding biomedical informatics. I'm Kevin Johnson, a physician and informatics researcher at the University of Pennsylvania, findable on X at KBJohnsonMD. I'm thrilled to introduce you to our fantastic guests today. First up, we have the incredible Dr. Genevieve Melton-Mew, an associate professor of surgery and health informatics, it's a lot, at the University of Minnesota. From among her many impressive titles, she holds the position of president of AMIA, the American Medical Informatics Association, of which I'm a member, as well as director of the Center for Learning Health System Sciences at Minnesota. Her research interests have primarily been in the area of natural language processing and recently optimizing clinical AI best practices. We're also joined by Dr. Charles Friedman, known by Chuck by most of us, a professor of medical education at the University of Michigan Medical School and chair of the inaugural Department of Learning Health Sciences. He's also the editor-in-chief of the open access journal, Learning Health Systems, and has dedicated his career to bridging scientific discovery and implementation in healthcare. He's a friend to all of us and an incredible sage, and I look forward to listening to what he has to say. Lastly, we had Dr. Peter Emby, professor and chair of the Department of Biomedical Informatics and senior vice president for research and innovation at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. As a past president of AMIA, his work centers on data-driven learning health systems. In this episode, as you might imagine, we're diving into the concept of learning health systems. In essence, these systems continually gather and analyze data to develop care strategies for patients. While this virtuous feedback loop seems straightforward, and probably you thought it was everywhere, not every health system operates as a true learning health system. Our guests share their insights on what this looks like in practice, offering a range of perspectives on the best approaches, but I won't spoil too much for you. Let's get into the episode. Hello, friends. Good to see everybody here. You guys all doing okay?
Yeah, great to be here.
Oh, great. Well, welcome to Informatics in the Round. I've already introduced it, so we don't have to do that. I'm really excited about today. This is actually a topic that we've never covered, even though I, in fact, have been at two different institutions that claim to sort of have invented what this is. And I, of course, know neither of them is correct. So with that, Chuck Friedman, who are you?
Hi, everybody. I'm Chuck Friedman. For, 9 more days, I am the Josiah Macy Professor and Chair of the Department of Learning Health Sciences at the University of Michigan Medical School. I have joint appointments in the School of Information and Public Health. After those days go by, I will have ended my 10 years as founding chair of that department, and I will return to teaching and research, as they say, as a professor in the department. And I'm looking forward to the many things I would like to do with that found time.
Well, as you might imagine, I totally understand what you're about to go through. Genevieve, who are you?
Hi, I'm Genevieve Melton-Mews. I'm a professor of surgery and health informatics at the University of Minnesota. I also serve as the director for our Center for Learning Health System Sciences and our senior associate dean for health informatics and data science. And then in our health system, I serve as our chief health informatics officer. So just a couple of roles.
Just a couple of roles. Great to see you. Peter, who are you?
Hey, everybody. I'm Peter Emby. I am the chair of the Department of Biomedical Informatics and senior vice president for research and innovation at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. In my chair role, I got to succeed this pretty great guy named Kevin Johnson, who previously was here. So Fantastic opportunity to lead a great group here. Been here for about 3 years in that role, and in addition, relevant to this topic, I have been for a while and continue to be one of the leaders of our Learning Health System training program here at Vanderbilt. Previously, I was doing that at my last institution, Indiana University, and I held a previous role at my last organization as a vice president for Learning Health Systems. So excited to be talking about this topic with you.
Well, this is going to be great because I think with my first question, we're going to start attacking some of the myths. I could imagine that if I was a patient listening to this who went to Vanderbilt or who was at Penn or was at either of our other institutions, they'd be saying, isn't every health system a learning system? I mean, what else are you guys doing if you're not learning? You say you're the practice of medicine. So, Chuck, can you help us out with this? What the heck is a learning health system?
Well, let me start by saying that one of our wonderful colleagues, Bill Yasnoff, gave a talk here several years ago where he made exactly that point, that we've always had a learning health system. It just hasn't worked very well. And he actually gave it grades on various components of what a learning health system would do, and he went decade by decade. It was a brilliant talk, and we have it recorded somewhere. I should pull it up.
Yeah.
In any event, I think it's true. We've always had a learning health system. What we are doing now is trying to make it a whole lot better. And to my way of thinking, the way of making it a whole lot better is by institutionalizing a marriage of discovery to implementation and apply that marriage to important system problems, what some people call burning platforms,
Yeah.
to develop system solutions to those system problems that will be enduring and also adaptable to inevitable changes that come along. And I think what makes that a system is that co-occurring improvement projects of this type could share support from a socio-technical infrastructure. And it's that infrastructure that makes a system a system. Otherwise, what you have is disconnected improvement efforts with everyone a tub on its own bottom, and that is simply not scalable or sustainable. So I think a learning health system is these marriage to discovery implementation efforts, all supported by a shared infrastructure.
Okay, does that one definition work for all of you?
It certainly does for me. I think that's a fantastic definition. To your earlier question, and I think riffing off of Chuck's comments, I'll often reflect the same thing. We're always trying to learn and improve if we at least we think that's what we want to do, and we certainly attempt to. And so I think to the degree that we have all kinds of different ways of being able to capture and analyze and learn and improve, sometimes there's a lot of different activities that might take on different names, or quality improvement or research or what have you. And depending on who you are and how you're approaching it, you might use some of those other terms. All of those, I think, to Chuck's definition, come into play at that marriage that he's talking about.
So it's more than just new wine in old bottles.
Yeah, I haven't used the marriage analogy. I usually actually talk about a different animal. So maybe it's the child of the marriage. But, I talk about sort of this idea of we're building a different animal is usually what I say, that we're bringing the best of kind of healthcare delivery, the best of research together in a different way, much closer together. And to Chuck's point, it has to be pretty systematic and being sure that we're thinking of all those foundational pieces, but it's got to be real world and pragmatic.
So, okay, I'm a patient. I come to a hospital. I have a regular old diagnosis. Let's just say maybe I have possible sepsis, and my family is told, thank goodness we have a learning health system here. Because of our learning health system, blank. What should I expect?
You should expect that the way in which this person is being treated reflects a process that has been ongoing for some time that has taken data and analyzed it and applied that data to improve the way that person's care is being administered. Moreover, the way in which this was done was very inclusive. The process of improvement was co created by many, many types of people, very much including patients. So, what was done here and what was implemented here very much includes a patient's point of view, keeping the patient at the center of everything that's done.
Yeah, well said. I think that's right. And that assumes, I think what Chuck's just described, of course, is the ideal.
Right.
So when you said we have a learning health system here, if it looks like what Chuck just described, I think we would all agree. Sometimes we'll say, "Oh, we have a learning health system here," and the question is, okay, has it really applied in that particular circumstance? Will it really apply to my care? Has that really happened? Is it in the process of becoming that ideal learning health system? Does it exist in pockets, or is it truly systematic? Those are all possibilities because of kind of where we are in history here, and how we continue to improve upon what we've had before. But completely agree, that's the goal.
And maybe to add to what both Peter and Chuck were saying, at the end of the day, that it would be that patient that's coming in, say you're coming in with possible sepsis, you're getting the most evidence base, it's personalized to you, and we're learning from you and your data, and it's being fed back in. Maybe we're learning that we didn't do it right, and we're hopefully informing others.
So wait, you're telling me that you're going to use my data. Do I get paid for this? I mean, if I'm actually going to contribute to the way care is being delivered, should I get something from it in return?
Yeah.
I love. This is what happens. This is what happens when you have a lot of people who are very wise. Total silence. Like,
We're all too
I
experienced
was
to know
on
that.
first the last two times, so I was waiting for one of my colleagues to
yeah,
bounce.
yeah.
Well, we can talk about patient data monetization and should patients be benefactors of that. I will say in most cases today, patients hopefully, and we have really put that at the forefront, or at least participating in the research process. But we today do not remunerate patients. I think the whole idea of data monetization, it's definitely out there, but remains a pretty controversial thing. And institutions have really had different philosophies around that. But it's certainly out there.
Well, just to add to that, if you're doing this well, you're actually spending money as an organization kind of above and beyond what you're actually getting paid for to take care of that. Let's say you came in with sepsis, and we as an organization are getting paid by your insurance company or what have you to take care of you. Putting a learning health system in place and actually making that work, as has been described, actually costs more. But it is absolutely our sort of moral and ethical obligation to do that, and we should be doing it. And so, investing in that and doing it, the real payback, I think, is not only to that individual, but to the people who come later, and to and to society generally. And that we are, after all, working in an environment where I think a lot of people expect that we should be learning from these things,
Yes,
so that in fact
yes.
things continue to get better. And if we're not doing that, for the most part, in my experience, the question from patients usually isn't, "Hey, am I going to get paid for that?" It's, "What do you mean you're not learning from my data so that you can actually make things better? You should be doing that."
Right.
And
I
if I
agree.
could riff on that just a bit, there are values there that really are fundamental to learning health systems, and what this discussion reminds me of is altruism.
Yep.
And at some point, this notion of altruism is very important to what makes a learning health system run. And I think you could say to this patient, well, you are the beneficiary of learning that has already taken place by people who, out of a sense of altruism, have made their data available without seeking compensation to inform better care for you. And doesn't it make sense then that you should do the same for the patients who will follow you, uh, seeking care for the same problem you have? But just as you are getting better care because of someone else's altruism, they will get better care because of yours.
I like it. Okay, so this patient understands everything, and then somebody comes up to them and says, "We are conducting a pragmatic trial. We don't require your consent, but you should know this is a part of how our magnificent system improves." So I'm a patient. I've heard of clinical trials. Maybe I even understand learning health systems. What's this pragmatic trial? Is that the same thing as a learning health system, or is it something very different? Actually, let me start by this. Define the word pragmatic.
Yeah, excellent. So yeah, there's three different words there: pragmatic, clinical, and trials, right? So pragmatic in this context, what we really mean by that is something that is kind of it's a type of clinical trial. In other words, a research study that involves some kind of intervention that we're doing, that we're testing to see whether or not it actually makes a difference in care,
Great answer.
and it's happening in a real world environment, using the real world practices and the like that we are already doing. And so it's very practical and pragmatic in the sense that it's happening in a real world setting. And it is a core element and a core methodology and approach of what should be a whole collection of approaches and methods and capabilities that create a learning health system. So it's one way of that marriage of discovery and implementation. We should have that tool in our toolbox, the ability to conduct pragmatic clinical trials. It's not the only way we should be learning, but it is a key one. And then back to your original question, I would say briefly that with regard to a pragmatic clinical trial in the case of, like, let's say sepsis, what might that look like? That might look like we have two different antibiotics we could use to treat sepsis. Oftentimes we don't know we know you have sepsis. We know it's a bacteria of some kind. We don't particularly know exactly which one or exactly how susceptible it's going to be. So we have broad spectrum antibiotics that we use, and we can pick one or we can pick the other. And we may not have really good evidence to say that one is superior to the other one. So we want to actually do a study to figure out whether one is actually better than the other. And there's no right answer right now. So it's ethically and morally and clinically appropriate to just choose either one. But we'd like to develop evidence so we could actually learn which of these is actually going to be better in a particular circumstance. So we are going to randomize people every time a new patient with sepsis comes in. We're going to say randomly, we're going to either give you antibiotic A or antibiotic B. And over time, we're going to develop the evidence we need to be able to determine whether one is actually superior to the other, whether one causes more benefit or more harm. And then we'll have that evidence, and now we can actually apply that back into practice. So that becomes a routine recommendation moving forward.
So I guess one of the keys to this, which I think is a Genevieve question, which relates to what Peter said, which is if you're doing a pragmatic trial, which means you presumably have to have these data that are in a format that's appropriate for analysis and structured so that you can identify who received one intervention versus who didn't and all of the potential kind of covariates. Genevieve, are we ready for that at most hospitals?
So I think that hospitals and hospital systems are all at different places. And we've learned a ton over the last 3 years as we've um, really tried to see, how does it work in real practice when you have pragmatic interventions, when you're doing pragmatic trials. I think what we've learned is that this is a place where informatics collaboration is absolutely essential. We have really had to do a lot of collaboration with our electronic health record vendors. Some of the ways that you might approach randomization, creation of the tools, and also just understanding the realities of operations. That all takes a lot of careful consideration. And we've all learned in the process, whether it's the person that's leading our statistical group, the folks in operations, or our IT teams. The other thing we've learned is that really having a mixed methods sort of approach to understanding why something doesn't work or does work And we've really also taken on this mantra of being adaptive in the process, and being able to kind of rapidly figure out if something is or is not working. We can then go to the thing that we know will work. But going back to the question of, are most health systems ready? I think no. Like we talked about this other animal or this different thing. This is a new muscle that many of the groups need to build. So this idea of how do we collaborate and learn together is really, really important. We've certainly learned a lot from the other organizations that we've worked with in these processes.
Kevin, can I make a comment here that sort of combines what Genevieve just said with my need to get up on my soapbox about pragmatic trials?
Oh, I absolutely encourage it.
Okay. So I don't think pragmatic trials are learning health systems. I because and even by their name, they are discovery and not implementation. And they leave open the question of whether uh, anything will be implemented at the end. In fact, I've seen many presentations by pragmatic trial experts who have presented the primary results of their trials and the value of what they're doing by flashing a number of journal article headers on a screen. And if you are saying that the primary product of your effort is a splash of journal articles in top flight journals, you're doing discovery. You're not marrying discovery to implementation. You're creating a potential. But
Okay, I have to push back. So there's hypothesis testing and there's hypothesis generation. Discovery's a word that I think is a little bit harder to grasp. So in the world of what we do in terms of scholarship, is what you're saying that a pragmatic trial looks more like hypothesis generation than testing?
no, no, it's hypothesis testing. The hypothesis is 81 milligrams of aspirin or 325. That's a hypothesis.
So isn't discovery in that case really just validation of a hypothesis?
So it's discovery. Yeah, I mean, we will know after doing a pragmatic trial, like the adaptable trial with the aspirin, whether 81 or 325 is in the best interests of patients who take aspirin prophylactically. But I would argue that so you have a result. Two things are missing from that. One is the commitment to do something with that result. And the other is the ability to learn from that implementation.
Yes.
So I don't think pragmatic trials are learning health systems. And to connect to Genevieve's point, and now I'm going to get into trouble with some of my colleagues who aren't here. Uh,
You
I think
haven't already?
pragmatic trials are.
Don't, hey, listen, Chuck. We'll just keep this part between us. Nobody else will hear it.
Oh, right. Yeah, thanks. I think pragmatic trials are a kind of a shortcut to something that resembles a learning health system and that can be called a learning health system.
Oh, no, he didn't. Are you-
And in part, you can execute this shortcut, and here I'm coming to Genevieve's point, by collecting data prospectively to do that trial and collect very, very high quality data for that specific purpose without creating the kind of general purpose data resource that a learning health system infrastructure really requires, an infrastructure that will enable a kind of agile ability to study a wide variety of questions instead of just the one the trial is organized to explore.
wow.
So, Chuck, I mean, a, I think pragmatic trials are an important tool in the learning health system paradigm, but I totally agree it's not sufficient.
Yeah, yeah, and I'll jump on here too. It's kind of going back to what I said earlier as well, in that in order to really create a learning health system, it requires a range of methods, expertise, processes, infrastructure. It's a
Yep.
system,
Yep.
and so I agree with Chuck in that pragmatic clinical trial capability does not equal a learning health system. But is a pragmatic clinical trial capability a core part of what could be a learning health system? Sure, of course it could be, and in fact, in many cases, it probably should be in an ideal state. But there's a lot of other methods and approaches and capabilities that are needed if you really want that. And I think just to further kind of dive into what Chuck and Genevieve have said, part of the important distinction here between discovery and implementation is that once you've discovered something and you've done it really well and you've published it and it's in a journal and it's out there in the world, that's great. But if you don't, if it just sits on the shelf behind me or behind you, Kevin, and we basically have it there and it's collecting dust, and it doesn't actually make its way, that knowledge doesn't actually make its way into improving practice and actually changing the way we do things, then we haven't completed that cycle, that virtuous learning cycle that Chuck is so great at talking about and has really sort of evangelized about very appropriately. That is really the key, right? So when we talk about a learning health system, we always think about that connection between, yes, we have to discover, but then we also have to deploy and implement. And then we have to monitor once we've done that to make sure it's working effectively and continue to refine it and improve it. And it's this ongoing virtuous cycle. If you only do the first part of that, you don't have a system, you don't have a cycle. Therefore, you haven't completed that loop.
Total silence. Once again, the
I
wisdom.
promise to step down from my soapbox.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, let me get you back up on your soapbox. And this is a question that I'm sure a lot of people have. And I have to be honest, I had when I was at Vanderbilt and we started up our learning health system. On the one hand, the word pragmatic makes it sound as if it is not structured, that this is what we have, this is who we get, everybody's in, it's a structure, it's not a structured thing. But that is so far from true. So Chuck, you and Jeremy wrote one of the early Bibles about evaluation in our field. And you included what became implementation science in some ways and some of those frameworks. And you're one, this, but one of the papers of yours I love is Where's the Science in Biomedical Informatics, because it reminds us that there are evaluative steps along that entire continuum. So when I first thought about pragmatic trials, I never equated them with the kind of academic scientific rigor that we would have put into an NCI clinical trial or even an A/B testing trial. So talk to us a little bit about that. What are the common mistakes people who think they have a learning health system, they're about to do a trial to decide whether A or B is better? What are the mistakes they make? Who are the people on the team that they forgot to include? What's wrong with what they're probably thinking they're going to do?
I think pragmatic trials, from the point of view of method, that will lead to confidence, whatever a reasonable level of confidence that the result is at least internally valid, can be as high in a pragmatic trial as it is in a NIH-funded clinical trial of a new drug or some other intervention. Pragmatic does not mean sloppy.
Right.
Mhm.
That's really
So pragmatic goes to the kind of problem you are studying or the kind of decision you want to be able to inform. It doesn't mean methodologically cutting corners. So in that sense, I'm behind clinical trials. I think they can be extremely rigorous, and the label pragmatic does not mean non-rigorous.
Yeah, and some really easy evidence for that. Some of the top journals in the world are, publishing the results of these studies, and they're incredibly rigorous. And they wouldn't be doing that if there wasn't, really, really sound science behind it. Completely agree. And here again, I'll channel what you were alluding to, Kevin, in terms of one of the things that Vanderbilt University Medical Center has actually been a real leader in is actually conducting some of these pragmatic clinical trials. And while I agree with everything we've just said, and my colleagues here who actually run the pragmatic clinical trials unit, who are doing this groundbreaking work and publishing in the New England Journal of Medicine and other places on this, will be the first to tell you that's just a part of the learning health system. It's not the whole thing. But it is incredibly rigorous. And the evidence that comes out of those studies, to Chuck's point, is about as good evidence as we have the ability to produce. In fact, I shouldn't have said about. It's we randomize people. We do this in as evidence. It's the highest level of evidence we are able to produce is through these kinds of clinical trials. And right, the pragmatic part of that is just that it's happening in the real world using real world capabilities.
So is it possible, Genevieve, to create an in silico trial of this type of work? Because if you're saying there's sort of equipoise, both approaches can be equally likely, why can't we just go into the EHR data and mine the data and say, okay, based on that mining, this is what we believe to be true?
Yeah. So I think it's being able to do things like have time concordant controls, being able to really know that some of those variables that you need to be able to have in place, that you can do that. But certainly, I mean, we're doing target trial emulation. It's certainly gained a lot of traction. We're certainly seeing certain types of even approvals for different treatments, even coming from real world data. So I think to the question you're asking, I think there's a lot of belief that we do still have the most rigor when we do a randomized control trial, whether it is a classic clinical trial or a pragmatic trial. But we're seeing those things start to, come together in different ways.
And also causal inference, right? I mean, I think we've learned a lot about how quasi-experimental methods can still get us to some place that looks like a reasonable causal association.
Absolutely, yeah. And that lead with the target trial emulation, that's
right.
one of those branches. Yeah.
Right. So the other question I have, we are quaternary care systems, right? So tertiary care systems refer to us. That means that the data for any one patient is scattered across the entire possible continuum of care. And even Epic and its infinite care everywhere wisdom can't pull it all back. Stop smirking. So here's my question. Is that a problem? I'll just tell you my bent on it is, yes, it is. I mean, we've been working really closely with the FDA and the Sentinel Initiative, and they have this thing called ARIA sufficiency, which is basically a test of fitness of the data to answer a question. And we typically find that if you were to try to spread out all of the data you would need to find out the outcome of a particular disease, or all of the data that you would need to decide that a particular patient should be included, we are largely guessing in the care center in which this patient is currently getting their trial done. How does that impact what we're doing with learning health systems?
I think you're one of the things you just articulated is part of it is that it depends on the question you're asking and how sort of suited to purpose the data that you have are. So if you are trying to answer a question that really requires that you have the entirety of the data that reflects all of the care a patient has gotten and all of the interactions with the broad health system writ large, not one particular one, but the entire, let's say, U.S. health system, and you don't have access to all of that, and that's really what's needed to answer that question, then you're at a loss, and you're going to have bias in that, and you're therefore not going to have as much confidence that your answer is correct, and it probably it'll be a lower level of evidence. If you're instead trying to answer a question that is very specific to the environment from which you're drawing the data, that actually is just specifically about, intensive care units in quaternary care hospitals, and you've got that, you might be okay, right? So it sort of depends, which is, one of the cop-out answers, but it's also the reality once you get to a certain level of expertise is that oftentimes the right answer is it depends. So I do think that it definitely changes things. I can tell you, in my experience, for instance, previously I was in Indiana University at the Regan Street Institute, and one of the things that we had the benefit of there was the entire state's worth of hospital data and ER data and lab data from the entire state of Indiana, feeding into through the what's called the Indiana Network for Patient Care, the health information exchange across the entirety of the state. And having that resource and being able to look across health systems, being able to look at the entirety of that, even though, yeah, on the edges, there were some people who might have gone to another state, it was very robust, very complete. And there's no question that we were able to ask and answer with a lot more confidence, a lot more questions, and be able to learn a hell of a lot more
Yeah.
than if we were. And we knew this because we were able to say, okay, let's look at the data of just one health system in Indiana and ask and answer a question. And now let's take this entire data set that spans the entire state and all of the different health systems, and we get different answers. So
Wow.
it sort of is the evidence that you need to sort of prove the theory that if you don't have access to all of that, there's a lot of things you're not going to be able to answer appropriately.
Wow. Have you published that?
It's been published in various ways from the group there. So yeah, I think there's a lot of evidence of that. And I'll try to resurrect some of that so we can put posts up. But
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I was not aware that anybody had done that study. That's a really important study. I think that will, Brian and our Health Information Exchange colleagues were on this podcast earlier, I guess late last year, and it didn't come up there, but that's a really important point.
it's one of the things that pioneers and experts like Brian and Sean Granis and all of our amazing colleagues there that I had a chance to work with and lead, was really privileged. But they've been working in that environment for so long. I don't want to say they take it for granted, but I think they may not have brought it up because to some extent it's just sort of part of where they live, right?
So-called tacit knowledge.
Yeah, but it's absolutely it proves and demonstrates the point you're making, which is that if you don't have access to all of that, you aren't going to be able to answer all the questions in as robust a way as you might otherwise want to.
Yeah, and maybe just to add, I mean, this whole idea of data completeness and knowing that patients do have fragmented care, it's a really important puzzle piece. But I think the other part that you really pointed out is I don't think that quaternary tertiary care centers are necessarily representative. And we just need to, have that, I think, at the forefront. And as we think about how we build out this idea and we bring others to work with us on this, that we're thinking about the community hospitals and the community practice settings and the community in general, and because we're going to miss a huge piece outside of even the data piece.
So, to that point, I think these communities that in a learning health system try to improve against a problem have to be eclectic with the data they collect, meaning that you don't go into this expecting to be able to find all the data in the EHR necessarily. And I think this is one of the ways we can talk about the difference between a learning health system and a learning health care system. If we think we have a learning health care system and all we're interested in is what goes on in the care process, then it's reasonable to say in a perfect EHR and a perfect health information exchange environment, we would have all the care-related data we need to draw phenomenal causal inferences. But if it's a learning health system, I'm thinking of Patty Brennan's famous "Care Between the Care." When you're not in a formal healthcare situation, the data that are relevant are not going to be captured in an EHR. And if we want to understand what's going on in the care between the care, because this is a health problem and there are all kinds of factors that might be important to study, bearing on what the health outcomes are, these communities that are trying to discover are going to have to collect from other sources. It's inevitable. So I don't think we're ever going to solve, if we want to conceptualize this as a learning health system, I don't think we're ever going to have all the data we need in the systems that capture care processes.
Yeah. One of the things that you just mentioned, Chuck, I think is also worth articulating here in this discussion, which is that we've been using the phrase learning health system, and you alluded to this, but it's probably worth putting a finer point on that. A few years ago, I wrote an article with some colleagues about thinking locally and acting, or thinking globally and acting locally, right? The idea that we have local learning health systems, meaning how do we operationalize the learning health system principles and concepts at a local level, right? At the level of a hospital, level of clinic, level of a unit, what have you. And how do we do that, let's say, at the level of Vanderbilt University Medical Center, or University of Michigan, or University of Minnesota, what have you, Penn. But then there's the U.S. learning health system, right? And you wrote about this, of course, early on, Chuck, right? When you were at the Office of the National Coordinator, like, how do we actually achieve that? And those are tightly connected concepts, and the concepts are portable, but the way you operationalize those things, the way you actually have to resource them and stand them up and operationalize them, are pretty different, and they require different considerations, different investments, different levels of expertise, but they have to be coordinated with each other. And so, harkening back to my experience in Indiana, we were doing work with our local health system partners, Indiana University Health, Eskenazi Health, et cetera. But then we also had this statewide health information exchange where we could also work across health systems as well. That allowed also to illuminate some of those differences and some of the similarities. And I think that's still work that it's still nascent. I think there's still much more work to do there, but I think it's an important thing to further characterize and sort of call out that when we're talking about the learning health system, we kind of have to talk about which level we meet.
So, Genevieve, related to that point, this is obviously a silly question to ask, but I'm still going to ask it. Every single health system is different. We are still very much in this cottage industry, which is healthcare in this country. Should there be a central, could the Joint Commission create a learning health system framework that they use as a part of the accreditation process? Would that work?
That's a great question. I do think that when we think about some of the things around, say, trauma certification, stroke certification, in some ways, I think that's really what they're trying to emulate around a set of disease processes. And they are, not only saying put in evidence-based care, how are you thinking about the outcomes and the processes that you've put in place for your patients, as well as what are you learning? They do require usually a research perspective, as well as folks from operations and the medical leadership who care about it. So, in many ways, I think they've done it at a disease level. But for the thought leaders in learning health systems, and probably Chuck should address this more directly, there's been a lot of work that's being done around what does a learning health system maturity model look like, and then the thought of then how would we measure that as somebody came in and evaluated that. And I could comment whether it's Joint Commission or something like how HIMSS does certification, or some of our other expert society groups. You could imagine something like that. Chuck, I don't mean to take it all away, so go ahead and maybe comment on that.
Oh, no. That was great. I'll just make a quick comment about the importance of this level idea. And I think one of the really interesting system properties of learning health system is this almost fractal property, that no matter how small or large the level at which the learning system purports to exist, it pretty much does the same things. So we have individual organizations, which we're working on a maturity model for organizations, as Genevieve alluded to. There are learning networks pioneered by Peter Margolis and his colleagues at Cincinnati, and they've developed a maturity model, or maturity grid, as they call it, for learning networks. And then in Indiana, there's a statewide learning health system being developed at a higher level, a jurisdictionally defined level. And then Switzerland has a national
Wow.
learning
Yeah.
health system. So we've got this level property to learning health systems. And if you're a system scientist, which I'm not, so when I venture into this, it's very dangerous. Uh, but you can compose from lower levels to higher levels. And if we're going to get to a national system someday in this country, uh, it'll probably be through bottom up composition rather than top down fiat.
So, given all of the the fractal like nature of this, but also the variety of implementations, can you tell me one seminal thing that you believe learning health systems have taught the rest of our community?
Genevieve, go first.
That's called Genevieve. You are the current big honcho at AMIA. You should lead this.
Oh, great.
For those of you who don't know, this would be Chuck getting Genevieve back.
I think the one seminal thing that the conversation about learning health systems is bringing is a different conversation about translational science. And I think that, I think when Francis Collins retired, he said, I wish that I had spent more time investing in this last mile, really getting to the patient and being sure that, the translation is, that all this work that we're doing is actually going to make a difference and that it's actually going to reach care.
Wow. Yeah.
So that at the end of the day, I think is the most seminal contribution, that this work has the promise and in some cases is making a difference.
Wow,
See,
good.
I told you should have gone first.
Great. It's really a great point. When you see the National Human Genome Research Institute actually put out and now fund new. Now we're talking about the Human Genome Research Institute. That's all about genomics and genetics, and to your point about Francis Collins, and they just are in the process of awarding sites and coordinating centers around the genomic enabled learning health system. When they're using the learning health system moniker, I think that's a whole other level of achievement in terms of a recognition of exactly what you just said, Genevieve, right? That this is now something that we recognize has applicability. I think there was a time when people would have said, well, no, if you're talking about genomic science and that kind of thing, that's not about learning health systems are over here. They're in the, healthcare quality sort of realm. That's AHRQ's domain, or that's somebody else's domain. But, the NIH is embracing that at the level of some of the most foundational science institutes, all the foundational science that happens across the institutes. So I think it's a really good point.
Although I will say, I kind of alluded to this earlier, and I've said this publicly, and I'll say it here too. I really think that NCI could have said that they had created what was a learning health system in all of the oncology groups. The cure of acute lymphocytic leukemia was all about learning health system strategy. And it was, the difference was that they had these protocols, they were adaptive, they absolutely fed those data back and very quickly made changes at the individual patient level. I mean, it was a fascinating story that I don't know that anybody's ever written it or done a documentary about it, but basically the cure, for all intents and purposes, of ALL in children was a testament to learning health system work.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And the infrastructure that they invested in terms of their computational infrastructure that became shared infrastructure and then evolved to sort of what we have now in that is vendor supported.
Yep, and definitely genomic. I mean, this was all about understanding the variants, that subphenotypic approach to lymphocytic leukemia.
It was a lot of it was really around discovery, but clearly with a focus on we want to make sure we turn this back around to then actually implement it in practice. And I think the NCI designated comprehensive cancer centers have done a really good job of adopting and deploying that. Yeah.
And people accuse me of being an amateur anthropologist, and with the emphasis on the word amateur. But I think some of that comes down to the culture of pediatrics.
Yep. Thank you. I agree.
And, and some of it
We're
comes,
happy, collaborative people.
you are. And also the nature of childhood disease, that fortunately it's relatively low prevalence. So
Sorry, I just thought I'd pull out my Swifty neck bracelet that my daughter made me, because pediatricians keep things like this.
yeah.
Okay, go ahead. Back to you.
We all get
all I was saying is that low prevalence of disease require cooperation across institutions.
Yeah, agreed.
And you couldn't be a tub on your own bottom. You have to work together, and all of that is part of the culture.
And we're second-class citizens who don't have any of the bluster that surgeons have. Sorry.
You can't take a lot here.
I know.
Yeah.
Okay, let me ask one more question, because we're going to run out of time, and I really want to think this one through with you guys. So I'm going to give you the STEM. The STEM is: you are not a learning health system if you, and I ask each of you to answer that. And Chuck, I will ask you to start. So you are not a learning health system if you
think you are, because you're just doing pragmatic trials.
Ooh!
Just beating that horse. Yeah. That poor horse.
You give me the puck in front of the net, and I'm going.
I'll let that be your answer. Peter, you want to go next?
So you're not a learning health system if you aren't translating your discoveries into practice that helps people
at your own institution.
Yeah.
Because I will tell you, I won't mention where. I should, but I won't mention where. I know of an organization that's published some absolutely, groundbreaking work in learning health systems, using their learning health system. And if you go to that institution, they can't implement it, because they actually had neither the people, nor the processes, nor the technology to carry through what they were able to do with all of the machinery in place for their learning health system. That's a good one. Genevieve?
You're not a learning health system unless you implement evidence and contribute to the evidence.
Love it. Well, any final word that I forgot to bring up that any of you wants to make sure listeners have heard and watchers have seen us react to?
I think it's great that you had this as a topic. It's something, and particularly on this Informatics in the Round podcast, because the learning health system isn't just about informatics either, right? We've been talking about it's not just about pragmatic clinical trials. It is a multidisciplinary activity necessarily, but I'm really proud of the fact. I think we're all really proud of the fact that informaticians have been leading the way in actually a lot of what we've been talking about here in terms of the methodologies, the infrastructure, because so much of this is about data. Of course, it's natural, but I think it's important to say that many of our colleagues in health services research, in quality improvements, in health system operations, and I could keep going, are really, really fundamental and critical to operationalizing this. And one of the most fun things about working in informatics generally, but also specifically in trying to operationalize learning health systems, is the opportunity to work across so many different domains, across operational and academic, what is often a divide between operational and academic parts of the environment, and across all the, my favorite phrase, across many silos of excellence. To actually make it real.
That's an oxymoron, Peter.
What's that?
That's an oxymoron.
Yes, right.
That's what makes it so funny.
Exactly. So it's really fun. It's really fun because I think, we all want to make the system better, and it really does require a team, and it requires working across disciplines and across all these divides, and that's a fun part of it.
Okay, so now that was actually my penultimate question. This is my final question. If you're actually using GPT to help you with your answers, please stop that now. Just kidding. And here's the question. The question is, I should have buzzers. This would have been a great question for buzzers. You can put your hands up and that would be a buzzer. If you could pick one song that we should play at the end of this podcast that best reflects learning health systems, what would it be? Chuck.
One of your colleagues at Penn came up to me after the talk I gave there, where I gave the titles of 3 anthems,
Mm-hmm.
and she actually wrote music.
Oh,
Go with one of them called Bring Us the Tough Problems.
excellent. Well, you guys, this was really good. And I appreciate you letting me play the naive person role here so that we could get some really good questions and conversation going. That was great.
Really fun. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you, Kevin.
Well, that was a great episode. It was really great to have Genevieve, Chuck, and Peter here to have a dialogue about some of the issues that relate to learning health systems. As you can tell, every organization thinks of them slightly differently. Some organizations are very sort of trial forward, others are much more analytic, and I think we're all very much in a learning phase in this area. But it was great to have this conversation, and hopefully each of you now understands it better and can ask whether you're a part of a learning health system or not. Anyway, thanks for listening to this episode. To hear about new releases, as always, find us on the socials at InfoInTheRound on X, Instagram, Threads, and TikTok. And if you have any questions or ideas or topics that you'd like to make sure we cover, message us on any of those platforms or email us at informaticsintheround@gmail.com. See you later. You can't do it all yourself. And that's okay. You do your best at the end of the day. 'Cause it's not about the person, it's about the institution. System problems need system solutions.